Power initiative, where we try to seize the tremendous solar potential of the Sahel countries for socioeconomic benefits. We have a target of 10 gigawatt of solar generation capacity, but also, of course, the new objective to provide access to roughly 250 million people living across the 11 countries of the Sahel, from Senegal in the west all the way to Eritrea and Djibouti in the east. Now, Desert to Power is sort of looking at this holistically. So there's a priority around increasing solar generation capacity, but there's also a recognition that if you increase the solar generation capacity, the amount of variable renewable energy, that there need to be more investments in the power transmission and distribution systems. So that's another kind of central pillar under Desert to Power. And of course, there's also enormous opportunity of solar solutions for providing access to all the people that do not have access to electricity at the moment. So decentralized renewable energy solutions is another central pillar under Desert to Power. We also have a focus on transforming the power sector utilities for them to be able to fulfill their mandate in their role, but also to be credible off-takers for private sector IPP developers. And last but not least, there's a strong focus around strengthening the enabling environment, building capacity as a cross-cutting priority. But we also wanted not to stop just at the utilization of solar, but also to see whether there are possibilities to move further up the value chain in terms of solar manufacturing. Of course, at the moment, pretty much all the solar products, solar panels, are imported. And it is a challenging endeavor to look into solar manufacturing, the different phases and stages, because it really requires to have all the required infrastructure in place to make this work at a scale that is economical and cost competitive with some of the prevalent suppliers of these solutions at this point in time. So with the support of the Korea-Africa Economic Cooperation Trust Fund and the Climate Investment Funds, we were pleased to recruit McKinsey & Company to produce this study for us, and we're pleased to launch this study today. Those here in the room, you will see you have the hard copy on the desk, but there's also a QR code that we will be showing shortly, where you can download the electronic version of this report. It's really intended to be the beginning of a conversation. It's not the end point. There's a lot more work in terms of feasibility, the various aspects of it that will have to be undertaken for this to be turned into reality. But obviously it starts with this initial analysis and with the identification of some of the priorities that need to be taken forward. With this very brief opening, I would like to invite now the Vice President for Power, Energy, Climate Change and Green Growth at the African Development Bank, Dr. Kevin Kariuki, to deliver some brief opening remarks for the session. Kevin, if you could come up here to the podium. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody, distinguished guests, delegates, esteemed colleagues and friends. I am honored to welcome you to this session, where we will delve into the groundbreaking report entitled Harnessing the Sun, a Roadmap for Solar Manufacturing in the Sahel. This report has been generously funded by the Korea-Africa Economic Cooperation, or KOAFEC, and the Climate Investment Fund, CIF. And it holds immense potential for shaping the future of Africa's energy landscape. It explores the opportunities and the challenges of scaling solar manufacturing across the Sahel region, and represents a significant milestone in our path towards a sustainable and self-sufficient energy future in the Sahel region. We are indeed grateful to our funders for their unwavering support and commitment to Desert to Power initiative and to this vital body of knowledge. As we convene here at COP29, the imperative on transition to clean and sustainable energy has never been more urgent. Today, we face both a profound responsibility and unprecedented opportunity to redefine the way we generate, store, and supply and store energy. At the heart of these transitions lies solar energy, which provides a viable and powerful pathway to reducing carbon emissions, addressing energy access challenges, and fostering socio-economic development growth, and for which Africa is blessed with 60% of the best solar resource. In this regard, the Sahel region, with its high-quality irradiation, is uniquely positioned to harness this renewable energy source and catalyze economic development. However, we all know that supply chain development is crucial for photovoltaic capacity growth. Yet, significant challenges exist, especially due to overconcentration of crucial value chain segments in specific geographies around the world. To address this challenge and enhance the resilience of our growing solar PV sector, the African Development Bank therefore decided to explore options for establishing the basis for a robust solar PV supply chain on the continent. In this regard, the African Development Bank's vision for solar manufacturing is continent-wide, with the Sahel region serving as a starting point. By supporting the Sahel region explore its solar manufacturing potential, our ultimate goal is to strengthen the resilience of the region's power systems and make it a global leader in renewable energy. The report offers a comprehensive roadmap for actualizing this vision. On the same vein, you will be very pleased to know that the bank has also launched a battery energy storage system mineral study whose findings will be articulated in a comprehensive, evidence-based analytical report on the pre-feasibility of setting up a battery precursor, battery and electric vehicle supply chain in Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, the foregoing, I believe, evidences our total commitment towards sustainably lighting up and powering Africa. Back to the main agenda of the day. To interest you to read the report, here are my quick takeaways from this report. It provides the centrality of the Sahel's solar potential in addressing the region's energy demand. The second one is that the strategic importance of developing panel manufacturing capacity in the region, including reducing reliance on imports, creating local jobs, accelerating energy transition, and fostering economic development. Thirdly, it also discusses the challenges for developing solar manufacturing, for example, the high input costs, as well as the limited technical capacity available in the region. And then, of course, the report looks at the opportunities that arise from this effort. Today's gathering, therefore, marks only the beginning. With the insights from this report, we are now armed with the knowledge and strategic direction needed to actualize our ambition for the Sahel region. But we cannot do it alone. We need continued support of governments, industry players, research institutions, and financial partners to progress these plans into tangible investments. I am confident that with your insight and recommendations presented in the report, you will join us in charting the pathway for expedited development of solar PV manufacturing in the Sahel region, thereby joining us in responding to the call to light up and power Africa for the Sahel regions and indeed the continent's socio-economic development. I will stop there and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for those inspiring remarks, really setting the scene for the panel conversation now. But before we come to the panel, let's sort of dive a bit more deeply into the findings of the report. It's therefore my pleasure to invite Adam Kendall, partner at McKinsey & Company, because McKinsey was in the lead in terms of developing this report. So Adam, without further ado, I would like to invite you to come up here and share with us some of the key findings of this report.
Thanks very much, Daniel. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed panelists, Dr. Kariuki, I have the easy job today. I have the job where I get to present the stuff that we already know and hopefully will create the conversation, and then some colleagues and friends have the opportunity to actually really engage on the discussion. And so I have the ability to just present the findings. Daniel, I don't know if you want to maybe sit over there so people aren't staring at you the entire time. Great. So I think it's quite fitting that this conversation comes immediately after the conversation that was had just a few meters away on M300. M300 is this incredibly exciting initiative, obviously by the World Bank, the African Development Bank, to bring energy to 300 million people by 2030. And what's particularly exciting about that is this is the initiative that we've been needing and waiting for a long time. And we know that solar will play an absolutely critical part of this initiative. What's also exciting about that is through this initiative that we're talking about today, harnessing the sun and basically building manufacturing capability, we're then also saying that Africa will be a part of the solution as well, and we're not just going to be looking to the rest of the world to bring the solution, bring the money, bring the goods. We can actually do some of this in the African context as well. So the background for this report is a recognition of two things. The first is that we have some of the best solar resources in the world, which you see on the left-hand side. And then the second is, over the course of the last 20 years, we've seen a very, very significant decline in the cost of solar generation, which is then ensuring that this is now consistently the cheapest source of generation, frankly anywhere, but particularly in the African continent. And that's the starting point. That's the point where we say, how do we build off of that to then basically build the manufacturing capabilities of the Sahel region to take advantage of this? There are many benefits for local manufacturing. I'm not going to go through all of them, but at the core, driving decarbonization faster is critical. The ability to create jobs. For me, the potential job creation of local manufacturing of solar panels is one of the things that I'm actually the most excited about in this space. The resilience in the supply chain. The critical minerals, and Dr. Kariuki mentioned the point around the battery energy supply chain. The critical minerals is something that's going to work throughout the entire space. And then lastly, local manufacturing creates the ability to attract foreign investment into this space. I'm going to go very quickly through different elements of the report, and you've all got it in front of you, but there are basically 6 chapters, and I will cover some in more, some in less detail. But let's get started with it. The starting point, and I know that one of the questions we've already gotten and I will get is, why are we focusing on 4 countries in particular? You know, the potential in this space is across all the desert to power countries, and frankly, to Dr. Kariuki's point, the potential is across the entire continent. We focused on 4 countries to begin with, just to really allow us to deep dive and really figure out what was needed in order to make this work. The recommendations in this report are relevant to all the countries in the Sahel, and frankly, to the full continent as well. But we started by identifying 6 dimensions that would help us narrow down to the 4 countries that we would look at. These included the scale of renewable energy demand, the development of the manufacturing sector itself, the political stability, which obviously reflects the ability for private sector to invest, the enabling policies, the enabling infrastructure, and also the ability to export. The goal is not just to manufacture for any local country, the goal is to manufacture for the region and the continent. Through those 6 dimensions, we narrowed it down to 4 countries as a starting point. And again, we're not saying that these are the 4 countries that we should be doing it. We're saying that if we were taking an investment lens, these are the 4 countries that you would start to think about as the ones that you would actually focus on. We'll spend a little bit more time today talking about Nigeria, which is the one that has the strongest current capability. But then what we'll also spend time on is talking about what other countries can do to improve their ability to actually participate more effectively in this space as well. We then looked at the value chain. Now, the value chain for solar manufacturing has elements that are complex and elements that are a little bit more straightforward. The reality is Africa has the capability to do all of these. Some of them will take longer to develop. Some we need to be developing more advanced technical capabilities amongst the workforce. But ultimately, the goal is that eventually we would be working across the value chain. For today's discussion, we focused on the module assembly, which is the one that we think you can actually already create very rapid movement already over the next 5 years. But we do see a pathway where you can actually get all the way to the polysilicon production as well. And forgive me, I am running very quickly through this because we definitely want to get to the panel and the panel discussion. We then looked at the economics. And the economics, not surprisingly, we're not going to pretend that if Africa builds this sector, we're going to be immediately competitive. It will take a while to build the competitiveness. And when you look at the economics, we see that if you build this particular sector and build the solar panel assembly, the one country that has the ability to be competitive currently is Nigeria. The reality is that's more than anything driven by import duties and tax policies than it is about the core manufacturing base that exists in Nigeria. And as we focus, we see that the ability of countries to make sure that the demand is coming from domestic sources is one of the things that's actually going to be important as well. But we see currently, if you build this in Nigeria, there is a pathway to profitability currently given current regulations, which even that is quite an exciting point. There are a range of things that these 4 countries can do to improve the profitability of their individual sectors. And so the first is obviously scale, expand the market. And so by expanding the market, one of the things we're saying is, how do you take advantage not just of the domestic demand, but how do you take advantage of the regional demand? The second element of expanding the market is, how do you expand the domestic market? Right? Even the Nigerian market as we currently look at it, what's officially formally announced isn't as big as what we actually think will happen. If we're actually going to deliver the 80 or 100 gigawatts that we all think should be happening across the Sahel, these demand numbers would be much, much, much higher. The second is thinking about procurement in the region and other elements that can actually improve the quality of the business case, and taking advantage of the fact that the region, and I'm not talking just the Sahel, but Africa more broadly, is already producing aluminium, bauxite, alumina, some of the important components that go into this. And then the last is one of the challenges consistently is logistics. So making sure that we're doing the best to reduce the logistics costs from a road perspective, but also then from a port, both from an import and export perspective. We then get to the type of interventions that we would be looking at and the things that are important to actually make this work. And I think this is where the bank in particular will play a key role in supporting different countries to make sure some of these things are happening. So the first is, as I said on the previous slide also, ensuring there's sufficient offtake. So ensuring that there's sufficient demand coming from the country. Now, we would say that you want to stimulate solar demand, and this is obviously from a national utility point of view, from an IPP point of view, and frankly, the C&I market as well. We see the C&I market evolving quite effectively, so can we make sure that the C&I market is effectively purchasing into the space as well? The second category is reinforcing the bankability of the business plans, bankability of the businesses themselves. Here there's a range of things the government can do in terms of driving and building skills, the skills development side. There's also a range of things that the governments can do in terms of infrastructure development. It's one of the great ironies that you need energy to produce the components to produce more energy. And one of our challenges is not having enough energy in this space. And so the irony of that I don't think is lost on anyone, but that's the type of thing that needs to happen, and where again, the bank and the private sector and the various different development partners will be able to play a role. And then the next is then looking further downstream, so looking at the localization of other parts of the value chain. And we focus specifically on solar panels. But when you are putting in solar panels, there's the grid racks, there's the cables, and frankly, if you go further downstream, you've got the conductor and transformers, which are all other areas where Africa has the capability already to deliver. In many countries, we are already delivering those elements, and that's something that we think could help drive and strengthen the business case even further. And then the last, depending on where you want to go and how far into the future you want to look at, is the role that African R&D can actually play in this space as well. Some of the innovations that are actually happening globally are already starting in the African continent and emerge from here. Oh, I don't know just what happened there. Sorry. Can we go back to... The next thing I was going to talk about, let's try and get the slides up, is there's significant, there we go, there's significant jobs. So this is not to say that there's 5,000 to 8,000 jobs. This is to say if you were to build a 500 megawatt facility in each of these 4 countries, it would be 5,000 to 8,000 jobs. The scale of what we're talking about is far greater than this. When we modeled it in Nigeria, we modeled Nigeria alone at a 2 gigawatt facility, which automatically is basically then just for Nigeria in the direct and indirect jobs, 5,000 and 8,000. And these are quality jobs. These are jobs that are not just construction jobs, but will be consistent and be necessary for 20 to 30 years moving forward. And realistically, as you build it, it's self-perpetuating because you're strengthening the capability to continue to build these, where Africa can supply, where the Sahel can supply the rest of the continent in this space. The other thing that we looked at is the business case. Quite simply, the business case again, in the Nigerian context, is positive. There are positive returns from this. We are already seeing a variety of players doing this, and the players are consistently constrained not by the ability of the business to deliver, but by the existence of the demand that's coming through from the governments and the private sector. So making sure that you're resolving that is an important element. But ultimately, the investment is not a significant investment. You've got a positive IRR on this investment, and we are already seeing several companies across the continent, and certainly some in Nigeria, actually starting to play in this space as well. We then looked at what are the things that could, if you were to focus on a country, and we chose Nigeria because it's the country where we are seeing the most positive economics currently. We then looked at what are the types of things that could actually be done quite specifically. I've covered these, and this is just in a little bit more detail. So the first is driving the demand stimulation. And so there's elements that can be done on the regulatory side there, and there's elements that can be done in terms of the access to finance. Ultimately, the thing preventing large-scale utility solar in Nigeria is the financial close of those deals. So sorting that out then creates the demand in this space. The second is training and capability development. We're starting to see some universities actually think about putting in programs in this particular space. Interestingly enough, the Rural Electrification Agency in Nigeria has a variety of programs with universities across the country, and one of the things that they're doing is actually developing the manufacturing capabilities in this space as well. The third is quite specifically looking at road and import-export infrastructure. And so we know, we all know the power situation in Nigeria, which is felt across the region. What can be done to make sure that you're putting this in industrial development zones that have consistent, stable, and appropriately priced power? What can be done to strengthen the infrastructure beyond that? And then, in addition, if you look at specifically the modules, how do you make sure that you're building the components around the modules? I look at the auto industry in a couple of countries in Africa and say, if you can accomplish what Morocco and South Africa have done, where you've got the auto manufacturing, but then you've got the secondary supply markets, how do we translate some of those learnings into this space is the types of thing that we should be looking at. So with that, I am now giving you the QR code, which allows you to download the report. It's available on the African Development Bank website. Actually tested it earlier on today just to make sure that it worked, and I'm sure, Daniel, you've done the same. But I appreciate the time, look forward to the conversation and hearing the discussion as we go forward. Thank you very much, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Adam, for this very comprehensive and very clear, succinct presentation at the same time. It's now my pleasure to invite my panelists who are going to discuss some of the findings of the report, and particularly how we can sort of take the report forward with me this afternoon. First of all, I would like to invite Daniel Morris, who's the Clean Energy Lead at the Climate Investment Funds, to join the panel up here. Secondly, I would like to invite Richard Nelson, who's the Coordinator of Power Africa, to join us as well. Third, I would like to invite Karnika Jorka, who's the Chief of Staff at Sustainable Energy for All. Would also like to invite Mr. Ramesh Kumar, who is Program Lead at the International Solar Alliance. And we also, I hope he is here, Dr. Michael Mehari, who's Senior Advisor of the Minister of Water and Energy in Ethiopia. Fantastic, Dr. Mehari, a pleasure that you are able to join. We're also supposed to have the Managing Director of the Rural Electrification Agency of Nigeria, but unfortunately he could not travel to Baku, and it's not possible to have virtual participation in the MDB pavilion. Let me start this panel discussion. I think we're a very distinguished panel. Maybe with Daniel, given that the Climate Investment Funds financially supported the development of the study, maybe you could sort of give a bit of perspective from the CIF side around sort of the importance that you see sort of around solar manufacturing, localizing some of these value chains in Africa. Maybe you want to sort of just give your sort of assessment.
Yeah, absolutely. Daniel, thank you very much for having me on the panel. It really is a pleasure to be here and talk about the report. We were really excited to see the results of this report, which was supported by our technical assistance facility, which was a small window that we established a few years ago that we think is having some pretty major impact, as you can see with a study like this. The idea with the technical assistance facility was we could empower governments and MDBs who see issues on the horizon. They see opportunities on the horizon to go in and start to do the kind of groundwork necessary to take advantage of it when momentum is there and when there's opportunity for investment. So, you know, we are as interested in solar manufacturing as we are many other types of climate solutions. In fact, I would say that our specific interest is what countries working with their MDB partners want to pursue for themselves. And so it really is heartening to see this work because we think it sets the stage for a series of investments that can come down the line. In, you know, maybe in Nigeria is the first place to start, but really seeing that the regional potential is there. And I think it will allow for the kind of discussions that we like to have with our member countries, our recipient countries, their partners in the MDBs, the private sector, civil society, and really everyone who needs to be a part to figure out how can we build the capacity for solar manufacturing in the region.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for highlighting those points. And it's indeed very catalytic financing that the CIFs are providing, not only on the investment side, but also on the technical assistance side. Let me maybe just move to Richard. Power Africa, of course, a key supporter of energy sector development for more than a decade. I think you celebrated your birthday last year. And we, of course, hope that this Power Africa movement is going to continue even after January 20th in the United States. But maybe you can give a little bit your perspective around sort of the significance that you see in terms of the solar manufacturing potential. What are sort of the ripple effects for the wider broader economic development of the continent, and how sort of Power Africa could potentially also play a supporting role?
Yeah, thank you, Daniel, and I too hope that Power Africa will be on good footing after January 20th. I have every reason to believe that we will, given our 10-year history. But thank you for having me on this panel today. I literally have been having discussions about this issue this week. In fact, I was meeting with Ramesh earlier today. We were talking about this very issue. I think everybody agrees, and I think the report actually captures it, and Adam was talking about it well, a lot of these benefits. Let me just start off with a story, first of all. So I used to work for Dell Computers, and I was part of their global site selection team. And we were looking to build a factory in India to supply the Indian market with computers. And we went all over the place, looking at different locations where to do this. We ended up building it in Chennai. And we built this factory, and we brought in the local community where we hired pretty much all of the staff, except for some of the senior managers, were locals. And we trained them, we were able to develop their skills, and then this factory started to produce, and it was among the highest level of among all the factories worldwide, it was among the highest productivity. It was exceptional and it was a benefit for that region, but also a benefit to the company. And so that's the type of thing that we're looking at. That happens all over the world, and people are looking and waiting for it to start happening in Africa more than it has been. There are a few places where it is happening, where it has happened. We've heard example of the auto industry. I know there's some examples in the manufacturing industry. There's a few in agriculture and a few other little places here and there. But the solar supply chain is one that I think we all would be very, very interested to see being much more diversified. And Africa has that potential to basically own this. Let me just share one other example. I heard just this morning about the importance of value add and having manufacturing on the continent. A colleague from Sierra Leone was saying that they exported, I think, $1.3 billion worth of iron ore last year. Only $40 million of it was retained by Sierra Leone. And so, again, that drives home the point. We've got to find solutions for more manufacturing, more production in Africa. What I would say some of the benefits are, and Adam highlighted many of these benefits, but the job creation is key. And many of these are skilled jobs. They are long-term jobs. We all know the youth bulge issue in Africa, and so any sector that can start to create jobs is going to be exceptionally welcomed. And so that's an area that we really see as being important. Ultimately, I think it can lower costs for the purchase of these panels and for this equipment. There was a company that I ran into in India, in DRC, but an Indian company that needed some more power, so they decided to build their own solar project right next door. And they actually manufactured everything except for the panels and the transformers. Everything else, all the steel, the cabling, all of that stuff, they manufactured there. And they're looking to expand that. And so I think they're demonstrating the possibility of definitely doing assembly and maybe even moving up that chain quicker. And that helped them reduce costs. And now they're building these same facilities for their neighboring mines. And then finally, I think it really does increase the reliability. You're not dependent on a single source of supply. If you can diversify, if you can have an African manufacturer supplying Africa, I think it just improves, it should improve the reliability of the availability of those products.
No, thank you very much, Richard. Also that last point around reliability, and I think after having gone through all the supply disruption, global supply disruptions caused by COVID-19, I think that's a very important point to highlight. And obviously in Africa there's a big push to build the African Continental Free Trade Area, so that if something is being produced in Nigeria, it could indeed serve the entire continent or other countries similarly. You mentioned India a couple of times, and I sort of couldn't think I should bring in maybe Ramesh a bit earlier, because obviously International Solar Alliance was launched with strong Indian support. You're based, headquartered in Delhi, and I think India has sort of gone through similar processes itself. Sort of, are there sort of from the International Solar Alliance perspective, sort of some lessons learned, maybe also from the Indian experience in terms of the manufacturing side, that could be shared and could also help sort of Africa sort of move forward in this regard?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Daniel, first of all, inviting me for this wonderful discussion. My congratulations to McKinsey to come out with a very, very impressive report, bringing out all the important points which are very relevant. This is a very interesting subject. Let me start in 2-3 areas. Let me start with the demand perspective. You know, we have recently, world over, we have celebrated crossing the 2 terawatt installation across the world. If I look at African continent of this 2 terawatt, we have less than, I don't know, about less than 20 gigawatt. So that shows there is a large potential for demand in the coming years in the African continent. So in terms of demand, as of now, it's a very limited and it can play a very important role in terms of demand. This is one of the first point I would like to emphasize. Second, you know, the supply part, if I see on a world over, we are in a kind of a very delicate situation. You know, the current rate of the yearly capacity addition, if you look at it, I think almost 3 to 4 times the capacity is already created in terms of the manufacturing. That leads to a problem in the pricing power. So this will be a very critical issue where countries need to look into this pricing issue. You know, when there is a supply is much more than the demand, the prices will always challenging. And then so this is one of the important issues I would like to bring as a challenge. You also touched upon India and some of the other countries were looking at this challenge, and you rightly pointed out the post-COVID and skewing of this in one country is always a problem if it's a monopolistic or all kind of issues it will invite. So it's very important, rather than looking at only the cost part of it, is important in terms of energy security or supply chain disruption point of view, countries to develop it. So India, last 2 years, the government has been very mindful of this, and they came out with the incentive scheme, which is really triggering the capacity increase of manufacturing. I would say in the last 2 years, from about 15 gigawatt, it's already the module manufacturing has crossed almost 80 gigawatt. And even the other part of it, whether it is cells and wafers, also in the it's increasing mode. So this production-based incentive has clearly a good idea which has come out. Even in US also, the Inflation Reduction Act has really resulting in the more manufacturing. So these are in terms of the stimulation of or incentivizing this sector. Finally, before I would also like to say about some challenges, because this is a very important subject we keep goes on debating. One of the issues maybe is the requirement of a very reliable power. This is one issue which need to be addressed if you wanted to set up manufacturing on the technical part of it, in the microsecond or the steady power. This will be one of the key issues which we need to look into. Let me stop here. I've touched upon most of the things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ramesh, for those points. I think particularly, I mean, you highlighted the critical importance of putting in place also the right incentives, mentioning some of the examples from India, but also even the United United States. And clearly governments sort of need to invest and prioritize this kind of work, and hopefully some of the international partners can also provide additional support to make this happen from a diversification perspective, and it's in their own interest sort of not to be dependent also on just one country or one region supplying the world. Let me bring in Kanika, who's from Sustainable Energy for All, as I mentioned at the beginning. And SE for All did also a report 2 years ago where you already sort of started looking into the solar manufacturing dimension. Maybe you could sort of reflect on sort of the further analysis that has been done, and also maybe if you've sort of seen any important developments since you have kind of worked on your initial report.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. And this is such an important topic. I think one of the things that this really brings to the fore, which is also was our motivation to work on this topic, was to really get countries to recognize that they're not victims of the energy transition, but really it is an economic opportunity of a lifetime that will allow governments to participate in energy markets in ways that they have perhaps not been able to before. So I think it's really, really good to see that a lot more countries are coming closer and closer to viability. I mean, I was looking at the slide which showed that while there was perhaps profit making only in the context of Nigeria, but that even for the other countries, it was really a few $1 million before you were at break even, right? And in the larger scheme of supporting domestic manufacturing and the localization benefits in the form of jobs, the creation of green production zones, and also just the balance of payment impact that something like this would do, that a couple of $1 million is really not very much of an investment in the first few years of supporting this. So viability is, in fact, at least from my takeaway from those slides, much closer than one would imagine, and that's why this is actually very interesting. In the work that we do, we've been taking the Africa Renewable Energy Manufacturing Initiative quite seriously, pursuing that with Kenya, Ghana, Nigeria, and South Africa. And in each of these countries, we kind of try and think about our support to countries at 3 levels. So the first one being really focused on planning, the second being on kind of matchmaking, and the third being on capacity building and skill development. And so what we mean by that is really trying to understand what is the competitive advantage of every different country. And this is, of course, a function perhaps of the existing industry that they may have, of their demand, but also of thinking about the kinds of skills that they may already have, and the trade routes. So it's a layered, let's say, many variables come together in determining that planning and identifying who has the competitive advantage for what. So for example, it's not just about solar manufacturing, but as Adam, you were saying earlier as well, that it's also about the supply chain, and thinking more and more about battery storage, about critical minerals, about end of life, and urban mining and recycling. So there's a large kind of value chain that governments have the opportunity to participate in. So we do that work and also try and map that against the energy transition plan and green growth opportunities for a country. So really trying to understand what is the economic opportunity and how this would offset some of the costs of the energy transition that countries will have to take on as they move towards net zero. But it's really one thing to have a plan, and you know, all of us here on this panel, and most notably at the AFDB, you know well that plans are only as good as the support provided in their implementation. And so really the focus of our work is also in facilitating collaborations and facilitating partnerships that yield results and outcomes, and then of course monitoring those outcomes. So we are able to kind of bring different partners together, try and match make also between different types of companies. You know, you were mentioning an example of, say, an Indian company that may have been present in the DRC. So we do a lot of and facilitate a lot of South-South collaboration, leveraging also the UN network in order to do that. But finally, and in carrying forward the South-South kind of focus as well as the motivation to facilitate greater learning and collaboration between developing countries, but also for them to have close cooperation and work in and speak in one voice. We also try and enable a lot of learning opportunities between regions and between countries, also because of similarity of where they are at in their energy transition journey. So we've been able to do learning missions between several countries in Africa. So Nigeria and Ghana, for example, did a learning mission to China. We did a Nigeria and Kenya learning mission to India for electric mobility specifically, and really trying to understand as well what is the kind of skills that are required, but also what are some of the specifications. How do you bring as much of the value chain in country, and make sure what are some of the participatory approaches that need to be deployed in order to keep as much of the benefit for local communities. So not just, at the federal government level, but really pass them down to local communities that have also been participating, let's say, in other similar or where very little amount of reskilling is required for them to participate in green manufacturing. So this is the approach that we're taking, but I also recognize that there's a lot more to be done, but also a lot of new sectors that are going to come into this. I mean, critical minerals is clearly one of them, and that's going to be one that will require much more integrated thinking between countries, and no one country is going to be able to do it alone. So we're actually quite a long way from localization, but I also think it's the biggest economic opportunity of our time, as I said before.
Thank you very much, Kanika. I think there's a lot that you've highlighted. I like very much the point around plans are only as good as they kind of lead to actual implementation. And I think sort of the whole kind of capacity building skills kind of dimension was also highlighted prominently in the report. And sort of kind of also learning from peers, South-South cooperation. I think that will have to be a key part in terms of turning sort of the potential into reality. Now, we've been talking a lot about the report, but we have actually not heard a country voice yet. So it's really a high time that we hear from Ethiopia. I'm really pleased that Dr. Michael Mehari, Senior Advisor of the Minister of Water and Energy in Ethiopia, is with us this afternoon. You've seen Ethiopia is sort of one of the 4 countries highlighted in the report. Now, a lot of people associate with Ethiopia, of course, the tremendous hydro potential, which we've also been able to support over the years. But Ethiopia has also important targets in terms of solar and has significant potential in this area. We recently received a request from Ethiopia to support a 125 megawatt solar power project. There's also private sector interventions being envisaged in this context. So maybe you could get a little bit the perspective from Ethiopia. How do you see kind of solar PV what role playing in the Ethiopian context? And how can you sort of kind of benefit and sort of take some of these findings forwards in the national context?
Thank you very much for inviting the Ministry of Water and Energy to this panel talk. Well, I think Ethiopia has given a lot of attention for hydropower, essentially due to the fact that it has a lot more potential than other renewables. This does not mean that we are not working in terms of energy or power diversification. So next to hydropower, a lot more projects are really emerging, particularly from the solar energy perspective, and particularly in the northern part, in the northeastern part, and in the eastern part of the country. Other than this, we often use hydropower for areas which are very close to the grid connection. And areas which are far away from the grid, we essentially focus on mini-grid connections using the solar energy. So my general feeling is the solar energy investment and solar energy development is getting a lot of attention from government. And also you see a lot of, particularly the retail sector, increasing and getting attention from time to time. But I also agree by the fact that we should not completely rely on importing all different components from abroad. So we should be able to have, some sort of connection either from, close by neighbors or by our own as well. For that, I think government has, devised a lot of incentive mechanisms, not only for the retail sector, but also for the manufacturing sector, incentive related to tax, incentives related to availing plots and sheds for the manufacturing sector are things to be mentioned. And, to reform the entire power sector, for, in its entirety, we have also power sector reform program, which is, the phase one is, close to completion, and we are about to start with the phase two. And all this, I think, it will certainly improve the solar investment and solar energy production. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, and I think it's encouraging to see that you're really expecting a significant increase in demand. I think the hydropower that you have is actually also helping. Ramesh pointed out earlier that you need sort of stable, reliable, dispatchable power to, 24/7 in a way to do the manufacturing itself. So I think that's clearly a competitive advantage for Ethiopia in this regard. And it's also good to hear that the government is already putting in place some of the incentives for manufacturing. I think Ethiopia is certainly a good case of bringing a lot of manufacturing in sectors such as textile and others to the country over recent years. Maybe let me come back to you, Daniel. One thing we haven't sort of really talked about that much is sort of the financing side of things. Now, the CIFs are, of course, a very important provider of concessional finance. You just announced earlier this week a CIF going to market, so there will be additional resources available. You've also launched recently the Industry Decarbonization Program. So maybe you could sort of indicate sort of what are the potential sources of finance that the climate investment funds could sort of provide sort of to taking solar manufacturing towards implementation.
Maybe we'll try this one instead. Thanks, Richard. Yes, happy to talk about the opportunities that CIF can provide for this kind of work right now. And in my previous intervention, I had mentioned the role of the Technical Assistance Facility. Why I think this study is so great, because it really shows that there is an entire chain of activity that can occur when you use dedicated concessional resources in really strategic ways. So we have this study that now is out and is painting a bit of a roadmap for countries to begin to pursue. And now the question is, where can they access the kind of finance that would allow them to build up the capacity for solar manufacturing? As Daniel mentioned, we just launched an industry decarbonization program. By launch, in what that means is in October, we sort of opened up a call for proposals for countries to put together expressions of interest as to what they would do with access to an envelope of, say, around 125 to 250 million in concessional, which we would expect to then crowd in a lot of co-financing from our MDB partners who are implementing entities, the private sector, and other sources. This program is unique in a couple different ways. One that we're particularly excited about is that it takes really a very broad view of what industrial decarbonization means, and it kind of spans the entire spectrum. So when you hear industry decarbonization, you often think about high-emitting industries and how, things like cement and steel and those that have really big carbon footprints. Well, we've actually expanded our definition of industry decarbonization to capture industries that can help lead countries down a decarbonization path. And so what that means is clean technology supply chains and really all parts of the supply chain. So countries with, with ambition to do both sides can come to us and say, we have an opportunity to maybe do some work over in the high emitting, but we have an opportunity to build out those clean technology supply chains and really help diversify the market overall and help build a domestic market. So you can kind of see the connective tissue. between the technical assistance work that was done to really help identify which countries are out in pack. It looks like Nigeria is out in front, but not far behind, Ethiopia, Burkina Faso. And so what that means is that those individual countries could determine for themselves this is something they want to do. And I recall from the presentation that Adam gave that you're looking about a $35 million investment in Nigeria to get this thing going. So you can imagine if a small piece of that is a concessional chunk, and that is expected to bring in co-financing from private sector, from the MDBs, then you can have an entire investment plan in one country that includes, a major flagship facility to start kickstart the solar manufacturing industry in the country, and then still do some other work. Additionally, if there are similar challenges that all these countries are facing, they could come together as a group and say, we have a regional opportunity here. Why don't we team forces and we can have the same kind of investment, use the same kind of financing mechanisms to kickstart it in a number of different places, right? Regardless of what those look like, we'll gather those and there will be a competitive process to see who gets access to the finance. But part of the financing envelope that we provide is there is a process that allows governments, MDBs, and the private sector to come together and really game out what investments look like. How can you build a robust pipeline of projects that can be executed over a certain amount of time? And one of the other aspects of the program that we're very excited about is how much we're looking to engage the private sector. So countries that put forward an investment plan will be expected to develop a pipeline where at least 50% of projects are working directly with the private sector. In fact, there's an opportunity for for private sector entities, whether it's specific firms or trade associations, to partner with governments to co-sponsor an investment plan, right? And really from the get-go, bringing the private sector in and building out that capacity to make sure that these investments are long-lived and you're really building markets in these places. So we hope that the kind of work that this study came from can lead to these sort of creative visions of investment, and that countries come to us with these ideas so that we can try to get these concessional resources out the door and really make some transformational investments for the continent.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and I think that's very exciting to hear that there is a real opportunity to tap into a significant pool of concessional resources, and I would hope that as a result maybe of that study, that the one or other country that sort of is highlighted with significant potential is sort of ready to put forward an application for particularly the industry decarbonization program. So I think that's also conversations that we will be having with the countries concerned. Let me bring in Richard, because private sector was of course mentioned a couple of times. Power Africa, of course, core mandate is really how to facilitate more private sector investment. So maybe you can give a little bit your perspective around how sort of private sector can be brought into this opportunity. And maybe also, I mean, the US has also been leading in the G7 context, sort of the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. And, there's a lot of focus at the moment in the Lobito corridor, sort of in Central and Southern Africa. But maybe there's an opportunity to set up something similar around sort of this solar manufacturing kind of potential in sort of some of the countries that we highlighted.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to take that piece first about the Partnership for Global Infrastructure. That is a key priority of the current administration. We'll see what iteration happens in the coming months, but the principle of G7 nations, of these developed nations actually pooling more resources to support infrastructure development across the developing world is an important one, and I think that will continue to be a priority. Whatever that looks like, I'm not sure, but that will continue to be a priority. And I do think, in fact, I really hope, and I'm going to be pushing for solar supply chain diversification to be part of that, and especially in Africa. And I believe that as I pointed out, there's a lot of possibility for that. I've seen it myself, and believe that Africa should be where that happens. And I think Power Africa is ready to start supporting that. As far as the way the private sector and public sector can cooperate, I mean, clearly that's, as you said, it's our core mandate. It's what we do because it's the private sector that ultimately is going to provide the sustainable outcomes across the power sector. And it will be the case in manufacturing as well. Obviously, the governments generally don't manufacture, and that's the place for the private sector. But the government has a key role. We've been talking about concessional financing and donors providing an impetus or like de-risking the investments for the private sector, but the private sector is going to have to ultimately dive in, and they're going to have to be convinced that it's a winnable business case, that it's something that will pay off in the short term and long run, and they're going to have to be able to take that step. So the question is, what do we do to be able to incentivize that? And we've been talking about what we as donors and development partners can be doing. The African governments are going to play a very key role in this, and we've touched on this. They have to be able to set the stage for this kind of investment. No company, despite all the concessional financing, is going to make that investment if they're not sure if the regulatory environment is going to be stable, or if the political environment is going to be stable. They're looking for a place that's going to be stable, where there's predictability for not just a couple of years, but for decades. And I mean, I've been on that side, on the business side, looking at where we're going to place investments, and that's exactly what we look at. Now, the other thing is governments need to be thinking about and be aware of, be sensitive to how these businesses work and their business models, and really have a deep understanding and hopefully an open-mindedness to accept that, you know, a company has to make a profit. Companies, I hope, would be transparent in the types of profits they're expecting, the margins that they're shooting for, so they're not hiding the ball. And then governments should be trusting them and then adjust the regulatory environment around that to make it work. So from a bilateral standpoint, I think that can be very significant. I mean, just using the example of mini grids, it's not manufacturing, but I was speaking to the mini grid sector in DRC, and some of you may have heard me say this. They said over 50% of their costs, business costs, are going toward taxes, fees, tariffs, import tariffs on equipment, that kind of thing. And they're operating at a loss. They're not deep-pocketed, rich companies that are running these businesses that the government should have a license to just take whatever they want, right? There's got to be the right balance. They should be paying taxes, but there has to be a balance, and they also have to be making a profit, or else it's just not going to be sustainable. And so that kind of mindset has to be, I guess, it has to be assumed by more and more of these African governments that will be dealing with this sort of reality if they want this type of investment to happen. The other thing is the regional terms. And this is where we get to the Africa free trade area, continental free trade area. And Adam, I did have a question for you. Did you make any assumptions around those those sort of trade barriers in terms of selling the product? You assumed existing environment. Okay. So if the AFCFTA is adopted across the board, that would then presumably lower the costs. It would increase demand as well. So, so that's an example of, as a region, if Africa were to wholly adopt that and eliminate those trade barriers, at least for these products, that could significantly increase the demand. It could lower the costs even further and make it more competitive. So, and there could be other regional examples of being where there's interconnectors in power, interconnectors in transportation that could be built to build out the infrastructure that wouldn't just benefit this industry, but others as well. And so there could be regional cooperation as well that governments could proactively address that would help to attract this and this investment and to make it more sustainable.
Thank you very much, Richard. I'm also very excited to hear that this could potentially be, from your perspective, sort of a flagship program under the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, of course, provided that there's going to be continued emphasis on this going forward. Kanika, let me bring you back in, just sort of in terms of the enabling environment that sort of needs to be in place, particularly also when we think about, the initial opportunity is sort of highest on the assembly side, but obviously the objective medium term is sort of to move further up in the value chain. Sort of what do you see sort of kind of the priorities in terms of those sort of enabling conditions?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think a lot of people on the panel have covered it. Ramesh was saying earlier as well. But I think that we're at an important stage to try and understand as well what is going to be the full impact of different kinds of incentives. There have been quite a lot of different types of incentives that have been tried, both in the African context but also beyond it, right? And that could be the reduction of subsidy for certain things. It could be the imposition of certain tariffs on imports. It could be the removal of import duties on certain parts. But it can also just be performance-linked incentives, which is often really good for manufacturing. And we've seen in other developing countries, as well as in other types of manufacturing where performance-linked incentives have really worked. But to create that enabling environment beyond just kind of understanding the trade-offs is also to link it overall to a macroeconomic climate and to really understand what it would mean to have different levels of localization. So if you have an assembly level of localization and you go from 10% to 50% to 80% to 100% in the course of, say, the next 3 to 5 years, what would that mean in terms of jobs created, of course, but also in terms of like local value, in terms of the balance of payments. And I keep coming back to balance of payments, especially because of the realities that we see on the African continent at the moment, including on currency fluctuation. And so in reality, I actually think this is all very much an energy security issue, and this is the energy security issue of this time, right? And in order to make ourselves have resilient supply chains, it's really important that we think about these things in a holistic way. Dr. Kariuki, you were saying earlier as well around some of the work that you are already commissioning, thinking about green transition minerals. And I think it's one of those really important topics that we are beginning to do some thinking around as well. And again, the enabling environment for that one is in trust building. And a lot of the manufacturing world and the greening of the overall supply chain is also a function of the relationship between governments. But what we find, at least in our engagement and our work, is good data and having reducing information asymmetry actually allows for trust building even within governments when the economic case of benefit sharing is quite clear. And I think this is really where we need to put a lot. This is why this study is a really good first step, right? And I think, and it makes complete sense why SIF would support a study like this, because it actually generates for them all of the information they need to go into transaction world. And so we're really happy to be able to support some of these topics as well as some of these governments, because in the absence of this information, there will still be decision making. There will be embargoes placed on mining, and there will be certain kind of incentives announced, but they will not be able to maximize the opportunity that these governments have.
Well, thank you very much, Kanika. And indeed, I think you really put it quite clearly that this is an energy security question for countries. Not only countries, but I think we also need to look at regions sort of to move away from a bit sort of the too much sort of narrow country focus. Let me bring Ramesh back in, and because a lot throughout the conversation has focused around the skills, the capacity building, etc. And I know that the International Solar Alliance is also working with a number of countries on sort of your Star C initiative, sort of building some of that capacity at sort of national level, and of course bringing in sort of expertise from outside to where required. Maybe you can sort of indicate how that could maybe also be a focus sort of in the work that ISA is supporting with StarC and other initiatives.
Thank you, Daniel, and a very important aspect of that. So let me talk about Ethiopia. Thank you for, we have been supporting Ethiopia for many fronts. One of the areas where we supporting Ethiopia, and there is the Addis Ababa University, we have made a center, the Solar Technology Resource Center. The idea is to create an ecosystem in terms of the testings and certification, and apart from the capacity building. You know, this is very important if you wanted to create the manufacturing, and that requires the testing facilities to be available in the country. So Ethiopia is, for us also, it's one of the very potential countries in Africa, and so there are multiple engagement with Ethiopia, and so that this is one of the important aspects which you talked about. These similar centers we are also creating in the other regional bases, so that a cluster of countries can have that facility to be used for all these testings purpose. At this point, I would also like to just take what Daniel Morris was talking about. It's very important. I strongly endorse him rather than going for individual countries. Maybe on a cluster basis, this could be created. Any manufacturer will look for a visibility or a certain scale for next 5 years. So that gives a lot of confidence for any manufacturing facility to be created. So that is one of the critical areas, and then that should be the way I think we should start on that. And secondly, one of the other issues is also create the demand which I talked about. So one of the issues may be the lack of large transmission connectivity is one which kind of is a bottleneck in scaling. But still there is a lot of regional solar parks, and which is shared among countries. These are the ways I think it not only economizes, and you can utilize the resources available with other countries. Some country has a larger availability of the land, the benefit can also come to the neighboring countries. So the cluster approach would be a very important approach. And the last point I also wanted to see, one of the very critical issues which in fact we are very closely working with US State Commerce Department as well, is the lack of ESG network, the ESG standards, which is not followed in many of this manufacturing. This is one area we also wanted to work closely, so that all these manufacturing facilities have a sound ESG framework, so that we can create in a diversified manufacturing on solar and all related equipments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ramesh. And I think that cluster kind of approach makes sense, sort of to look at the larger markets rather than pursuing a purely national approach. Let me bring in Michael. And Michael, you have heard a lot. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. When you go back to Ethiopia and you report back to Dr. Habtamu, the minister, what will be sort of your key messages from this conversation that you will kind of bring back to him?
All right. Well, I think I have to see things from a different perspective. The first thing is we have to do some major and realistic improvements. Not specifically to the solar PV manufacturing process, but I think the entire power sector should be reformed. Unless we make a reform into the entire power sector, the solar PV manufacturing process, etc., want to be reformed. So saying this, I think we have to be very critical in like a couple of things. I will mostly echo what Richard was mentioning. In Ethiopia and in more African countries, I would say, but what I know is mostly Ethiopia, the power sector investment, distribution, etc., is entirely dominated by government. So, this shall change from, this monopolistic kind of segment, and a lot more focus shall be given to the private sector. And you have to work, the talk. Otherwise, we won't really make any difference. The second is, apart from this, there must be operational reforms. When I say operational reforms, it may be through tariff adjustment, a timely based tariff adjustment, kind of tariff adjustment, kind of efficient investment planning. For instance, if you look at my country, Ethiopia, we are generating like closer to 5,000 megawatt, but we are not using the entire power production due to lack of investment in distribution, etc. So we need to have proper investment planning, improvement of billing collection, etc., reduction of distribution and transmission losses, etc. This shall be really improved. And from the efforts of the governments of Ethiopia, I think we are doing a lot more in terms of improvement of all what I mentioned earlier, in terms of tax exemptions, in terms of long-term power purchase agreements, etc. We have been doing a lot more. And I think those measures, they won't not only encourage the production of sustainable energy, but also the nation's economic expansion and job creations. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Michael, and very much applaud sort of the clear commitment here, to reforms. And I think we will be looking forward to working with Ethiopia also on the M300 compact following the summit, energy summit in Tanzania in January. But also clearly sort of to the importance of bringing in more private sector investments across the value chain. I think we have time for 1-2 questions, either to the panel or to Adam from McKinsey in terms of any specifications that you want in terms of the report. So if there's any question or burning comment here in the audience, please raise your hand. Papus, please, let me just...
C'est bon? Okay, thank you. I have just a comment, Daniel. One question, short one, already put to my neighbor. How did you choose these 4 countries? Among all the 54 countries in Africa, maybe you have a clear criteria for that. My comment will be, as said by Richard, about the tariffs. That will be, I think, to have this kind of thing in our countries, we will need maybe to keep the point in the higher level, to maybe a political level, knowing that, see, if you look at civil aviation or airlines, you see a very high turnover between the countries. The point is not you haven't a market in Africa, but if each country will launch a production of solar panels, we will be at the same situation. Then before all that, we will need, the first step must be probably to have a kind of political agreement between countries or regions of Africa to be sure that you will establish a real market of solar panels. Some countries tried for years now, but yeah, it failed, unfortunately. we need maybe to change our view on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Papoose. I think Adam will respond to the first question around sort of why those 4 countries. I have to say it's 4 out of 11 that were looked at in the context of Desert to Power. But Adam, maybe you can respond to the first part.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I think the first thing is it is 4 out of 11. So we took the Desert to Power Sahelian countries, the countries that are participating in that program, and then we ran them through a series of indicators that positioned them to determine who was best positioned to be able to successfully develop the sector. What I tried to articulate when I was on stage, and I'll just say it again, is this is not to say that only these 4 countries can do it. This is to say that these 4 countries, as things currently stand, are frankly best positioned of the 11 Sahelian countries. What I will say is that frankly, every one of these countries can do it, and it's a question of putting in place the right regulatory environment, the right enabling environment from an infrastructure point of view, and then ultimately, to Richard's point, it's ultimately going to be the private sector who takes the lead. So it's about attracting the private sector to be able to deliver this as well.
Thank you very much, Adam. Just to see if there's any further reaction from the panel. I think the point about sort of looking at it regionally, not everyone will be able to be an exporter of solar panels. It's the same like when we hear very often everyone wants to be a regional power hub, and not everyone can be, and it doesn't make sense for everyone to be a power hub, so we also need to think beyond, obviously, just the national lens. Just to see if there's any last question. I don't think there is. So let me really thank the panel for an inspiring conversation this afternoon. I think we have a couple of concrete takeaways and real opportunities also in terms of support from the technical assistance side, from the political side, and sort of from the concessional finance providers to take this forward. From the African Development Bank, we will be pursuing this agenda in collaboration with partners. So thank you very much again for having been here this afternoon, and join me with a big round of applause for the panel and also for Adam, who presented the study so aptly. And maybe we can take just one sort of picture of the panel, and Adam, please join as well.